They called me a burden and left me in a nursing home. But they forgot that the walls of that house held my name, my story, and every piece of the life I built. And it was there, where they tried to bury me in forgetfulness, that I discovered the true power of legacy. I still remember that grey afternoon in Manchester, as if it were yesterday. The air carried the damp chill of early spring, the kind that seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. I sat in the back seat of my son David's silver car, watching raindrops chase each other down the window. I didn't know then that this ride would become the defining moment of my old age. I thought we were heading out for lunch, or perhaps to visit an old friend. That was what he had told me, after all. But deep inside, there was a knot in my stomach, a quiet dread, whispering that something wasn't right. At my age, you develop a sort of sixth sense about people's intentions, especially when it comes to your own children. David wasn't talking much. He kept his eyes on the road, tapping his fingers nervously against the steering wheel. My daughter Claire sat beside him, pretending to scroll through her phone, though I could see from the corner of my eye that she wasn't reading anything at all. Silence filled the car, thick and suffocating. I tried to break it. "So, where are we going then?" "A little pub in the city," I asked with a faint smile, trying to lighten the mood. David's jaw tightened. He didn't answer right away. Claire glanced at him, then back at me, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You'll see, Dad," she said softly. That was the first crack in the glass. Something was wrong. As we drove, I caught glimpses of familiar streets in Manchester, places I'd walked countless times in my younger days. The corner shop where Margaret and I used to buy groceries. The park where I used to push the children on swings when they were little. Memories clung to each brick and lamppost like ivy, and it pained me to see them blur past the window, while my children sat in silence, strangers to the very history they were born from. Finally, the car slowed in front of a large red-bricked building with ivy creeping along the sides. It looked respectable enough. TD lawns, freshly painted window frames, a neat sign that read Rosewood Care Home. For a moment, I didn't process it. I thought maybe we were visiting someone. Maybe one of their friends' parents lived here. But then David parked, switched off the engine, and looked at me. "Dad," he began, his voice tight, "we think this is the best place for you now." I blinked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Claire leaned forward, her voice overly gentle. "The way people speak to children, or those they believe, are fragile. It's just, you've been struggling on your own, Dad. The falls, the missed meals, we worry about you. Here, you'll have people to take care of you, make sure you're safe." Her words hit me like stones. My heart pounded. In my chest. "So you're leaving me here, is that it?" David sighed, rubbing his temple. "It's not like that. It's what's best for everyone. You'll be comfortable here. You'll have company." The word he didn't say hung in the air. Burden. That's what I had become to them. A burden. I tried to laugh, though it came out more like a choke. "Kameni, you mean strangers? People who don't know me, don't know Margaret, don't know the life I've lived. You think that's better than my own home?" Claire reached for my hand, but I pulled it back. "Dad, please try to understand. We can't do this anymore. It's too much. You need proper care. Too much." Those words pierced deeper than any knife. I had worked double shifts in factories during the bitter winters of Birmingham. I had carried sacks heavier than my own weight, so they could go to school with warm shoes on their feet. I had gone without meals so they could eat. And now, at the end of my life, I was too much. They helped me out of the car, though I resisted at first. My legs trembled, not from weakness, but from the sheer shock of betrayal. I looked at the building again, a care home. They had decided my fate without even asking me. My life, my independence, swept aside like dust. Inside, the reception smelled faintly of polish and disinfectant. A young woman with a bright smile greeted us. "Welcome to Rosewood, Mr. Miller," she said, glancing at some papers on her desk. "We've been expecting you." "Expecting me?" I turned sharply to David. "You arranged this behind my back, without even telling me." He avoided my eyes. "Dad, we didn't want to upset you. We thought it would be easier this way. Easier for them, perhaps, not for me." My hands shook as I clutched the walking stick Margaret had given me years ago, the one with the small engraving of our initials carved into the handle. I wanted to storm out, but where would I go? My own home had been stripped from me in one swift decision, and I hadn't even been given the dignity of choosing. A staff member showed me to a modest room on the first floor. neutral walls, a single bed neatly made, a small wardrobe, a view of the garden. Everything clean, functional but soulless. No photographs of my family, no scent of Margaret's cooking wafting through the hall, no echoes of children's laughter, just sterile emptiness. As I sat on the bed, David stood awkwardly by the door. "We'll come visit, Dad. We'll check in often." I stared at him, my chest heavy with grief and anger. "Visit? You threw me out of my own life, and now you'll visit?" His face hardened, defensive. "It's not like that." But it was exactly like that. Claire kissed my cheek, her lips trembling, but I felt no comfort in it. "We love you, Dad," she whispered. I turned away. I couldn't bear to look at them. When the door finally closed behind them, I sat in silence. The rain tapped against the window, steady and unrelenting. My chest ached with the weight of it all. How had I gone from being the foundation of this family, the man who had built everything with his bare hands, to being left behind in a room that wasn't mine, in a place I hadn't chosen? That night, as I lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the muffled sounds of nurses moving through the halls, a single thought haunted me. They had called me a burden. They had placed me here to be forgotten. But little did they know, the story wasn't over. This place they had abandoned me in wasn't just a care home, it held a secret, a truth I carried close to my chest. And one day soon, they would discover that the house they had left me in was mine. When I lay awake that first night in Rosewood, staring at the ceiling with its faint cracks and sterile white paint, my mind drifted back to where it all began. Sometimes, when the present feels unbearable, the only refuge you have is the past. And my past, though far from easy, was built on grit, sweat, and the stubborn belief that life could be better if I worked hard enough. I was born in Birmingham, in the late 1940s, in a small terraced house that always seemed too crowded, too cold, and too loud. My father, Arthur Miller, worked long hours at a steel plant, his face always blackened by soot when he came through the door. My mother, Edith, juggled 3 jobs, sewing for neighbors, scrubbing floors, and working nights at a bakery. Money was always tight. We were the sort of family that watered down milk to make it last, and patched socks until they were more stitches than fabric. I was the second of 4 children, sandwiched between an older brother who always got the new shoes and a younger sister who got away with everything because she was the baby. I quickly learned that if I wanted something in life, I'd have to earn it myself. School was never easy for me. Not because I wasn't clever, I was, though no one cared much about that in those days, but because I felt the weight of responsibility. Even as a boy, I remember standing at the classroom window, watching my mates play football, while my mind churned with worry about whether Dad would come home with enough overtime pay for us to buy coal that week. Childhood wasn't about innocence or fun. It was about survival. By the age of 13, I was working odd jobs after school, delivering newspapers at dawn, hauling crates at the market, polishing shoes outside the station. My hands, even then, bore the cracks and calluses of a man grown too soon. I envied the boys who could spend their Saturdays at the cinema, laughing at the latest comedies. For me, Saturdays meant sweeping the floors of a butcher's shop, the smell of raw meat clinging to my clothes long after I'd gone home. Yet, in all that hardship, I found a strange sort of pride. Every coin I brought home felt like a victory, a small way of lightening the load on my parents' shoulders. I remember the look in my mother's eyes when I handed her my first full week's wages. At 14, her tired face softening into tears. "You're a good lad, Elaine," she said, using the full name I never much liked but endured all the same. "You'll go far one day." I didn't believe her then, but her words became a quiet fire in my chest, one that pushed me forward in the years to come. By 16, I had left school altogether. It wasn't unusual in those days. Plenty of boys traded books for work boots as soon as they could. I started at a metalworks factory in Birmingham, a grim place where the air was thick with smoke and the machines roared louder than any classroom ever had. The work was brutal, lifting, hammering, standing on concrete floors for hours until your legs ached like fire. But the pay, meager as it was, felt like a fortune compared to the coins I'd earned as a boy. Those early years in the factory taught me discipline, but they also taught me pain. My back bent before it should have. My lungs filled with dust I'd cough up for days. The older men warned us lads to take care, but at 16, you think you're invincible. I pushed myself harder than I should have, always volunteering for extra shifts, desperate to prove myself. Looking back now, I wonder if that hunger to prove I wasn't a burden, to show my worth, was planted in me then. The irony of being called a burden decades later doesn't escape me. It's as if life had been preparing me all along for that bitter word. Despite the hardships, there were moments of light. I remember sneaking away after long shifts to sit by the canals, watching the water ripple under the dim glow of street. It was the only place I felt truly at peace. I'd dream about a future beyond the factories, beyond the endless grind. I didn't know how I'd get there, but I promised myself I would. By the time I was 20, I had managed to save enough to leave home and rent a small room in Leeds. It wasn't much, just a narrow bed, a wardrobe, and a window that let in more wind than light, but it was mine. For the first time, I felt a sliver of independence. In Leeds, I found steadier work in a textile mill. The hours were long, and the foreman had a temper like thunder, but I was used to hard work. More importantly, Leeds was where I first began to build the foundation of the life I would later share with Margaret, but that's another part of the story. The struggles of my youth shaped me in ways my children never understood. To them, I was just Dad, the man who went off to work and came back tired. They never saw the boy who carried the weight of his family's survival on his shoulders. They never knew the cold mornings I spent delivering papers before school, the nights I went to bed hungry so my siblings could eat. Sitting there in Rosewood, thinking about those years, I couldn't help but feel the sting of injustice. I had fought tooth and nail for every scrap of dignity I'd earned, and now, in my old age, my own flesh and blood had stripped me of that dignity with a single decision. But I also realized something else. My life had never been about ease. Struggle was the forge that shaped me. If I had survived the poverty of Birmingham, the back-breaking work of the factories, the endless grind of proving myself, then I could survive this, too. I closed my eyes that night and whispered into the dark, "You're stronger than this, Elaine. You've been fighting your whole life. You won't stop now." And somewhere deep inside, I felt my mother's words again. The ones she spoke when I was just a boy handing her my first wages. "You'll go far one day." I didn't know then just how far, or how strangely, life would take me. But I did know one thing. This wasn't the end of my story. Not yet. When people ask me what the turning point of my life was, I don't speak of factory struggles, or even the money I saved through those hard years. I speak of one day in Leeds, in the late summer of 1968, when I walked into a small bookshop to escape the rain and saw Margaret for the very first time. It wasn't a dramatic moment, not like in the films where music swells and time slows down. It was quieter than that, almost ordinary. She stood behind the counter, her hair tied back loosely, glasses slipping down her nose as she flipped through a ledger. But something about her presence, calm, grounded, yet warm, stopped me in my tracks. I had ducked into that shop just to get dry, but I left with something far more important, a reason to believe in a future beyond survival. "Can I help you?" she asked, looking up. Her voice was soft but clear, like a bell. I stammered, something about browsing, though, truth be told, I had little interest in books then. My world had always been about work, not words. But as I pretended to examine a shelf, I kept stealing glances at her. She caught me once, and laughed not unkindly, but in a way that made me feel both embarrassed and strangely alive. I found an excuse to buy a cheap paperback I didn't need, and as she handed it to me, our fingers brushed. It was such a small thing, but in that moment I felt as though the universe had nudged me toward her. I came back the next day, and the day after that. Sometimes I bought books, sometimes I didn't. Eventually, I admitted I was coming for her. She laughed again, the same laugh that would later fill our kitchen, our home, and even my dreams. Margaret came from a different world than mine. Her father had been a school teacher, her mother a nurse. They weren't wealthy, but compared to the poverty I'd known, her upbringing seemed almost privileged. She loved poetry, music, and long walks by the River Ira. I, on the other hand, knew more about oil stains, aching muscles, and how to stretch a loaf of bread to last a week. Yet, despite our differences, we found common ground in our shared belief in hard work and honesty. She admired my determination. I admired her compassion. We balanced each other, my rough edges, softened by her gentleness, her idealism grounded by my pragmatism. We married in 1970, in a small church in Leeds. I remember standing at the altar, my palms sweating, my cheap suit feeling far too tight. But when I saw her walking down the aisle in a simple white dress, smiling at me as though I were the only man in the world, the nerves melted away. That day, I promised her a life better than the one I'd known as a boy. Keeping that promise wasn't easy. Money was always tight in the early years. We rented a tiny flat above a bakery, the smell of fresh bread wafting into our home each morning. The walls were thin, the heating unreliable, but Margaret never complained. She made the place warm with her laughter, her cooking, and the little touches that turned even the most modest room into a home. When our first child, David, was born in 1972, I held him in my arms and felt a fierce, almost overwhelming responsibility. I was determined that he and, later, Claire would never know the kind of hunger and struggle I had endured. I took every extra shift I could, sometimes working 14 hours a day, coming home with my hands blistered and my body aching. Margaret, worried about me, begged me to slow down, but I couldn't. My children would not grow up cold and hungry. Margaret did her part, too. She managed the household with grace, stretching every pound, sewing clothes by hand, making meals from scraps. She read to the children at night, filling their imaginations with stories and hope. She was the heart of our home, the anchor that kept us steady through the storms. By the late 1970s, after years of scrimping and saving, we managed to buy a small house in Yorkshire. It wasn't much, just a modest 2-story with a patch of garden in the back, but to us it was a palace. I still remember the day we picked up the keys. Margaret kissed me right there on the doorstep and whispered, "We built this together." And she was right. Every brick, every tile, every nail felt like a testament to our perseverance. That house wasn't just shelter, it was proof that we had carved out a space in the world that was truly ours. We poured ourselves into making it a home. I fixed leaky pipes, patched the roof, and painted the walls. Margaret filled it with books, photographs, and flowers from the garden. Our children grew up within those walls' first steps on the living room carpet, birthdays in the kitchen, Christmas mornings with wrapping paper scattered across the floor. Life wasn't perfect. There were arguments, struggles, and nights when the bills piled higher than the pay packets. But through it all, Margaret and I stood together. She believed in me when I doubted myself. She reminded me that the measure of a man wasn't in how much he earned, but in how much love he gave. Looking back, I see those years as the golden thread of my life, not because we had wealth or luxury, but because we had each other. Our love was forged in struggle, but it was stronger because of it. I often think about those early days when I sit alone now. The silence of Rosewood is nothing like the warm chaos of our Yorkshire home. Here, the walls are bare. There, they were covered with memories. Here, I eat meals prepared by strangers. There, Margaret's cooking filled the air with comfort. But what comforts me is knowing that we built something real. That house in Yorkshire became more than just a home, it became a legacy. A foundation not only for our children, but for something far greater, though they never realized it. If my children had remembered those days, if they had remembered the sacrifices their mother and I made, the love we poured into every corner of that house, perhaps they would have thought twice before calling me a burden. Instead, they see only the old man I am now, not the man who once built a life from nothing. But I remember, and as long as I remember, Margaret lives on. The truth is, that house, the one we built brick by brick, would one day play a role my children could never have imagined. They thought they had left me in a place to be forgotten. What they didn't know was that the walls around me had been mine all along. And every time I close my eyes, I can still hear Margaret's voice in that Yorkshire kitchen, whispering with quiet certainty, "We've built this together." When Margaret and I first bought our Yorkshire home, I never imagined it would one day become more than just the place where our children grew up. To me, back then, it was simply a dream realized, a roof over our heads that we could truly call ours. But as the years passed, and life carved its deep lines across our faces, that little house grew into something far greater than I ever anticipated. It wasn't overnight, of course. Nothing worthwhile in life ever is. Our children grew up within those walls, filling every corner with their laughter, their arguments, and the sound of footsteps thundering up the stairs when they were supposed to be in bed. David and Claire both left for university in the late 80s, David to Manchester to study business, and Claire to London to pursue teaching. The house, once loud and chaotic, suddenly felt cavernous. At first, Margaret and I enjoyed the quiet. We sat together in the evenings, her with a book in hand, me with the paper or a cup of tea, sometimes just talking, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. But as time went on, the silence grew heavier. The walls seemed to echo with absence. Then, in the early 1990s, Margaret began volunteering with a local church group that visited elderly neighbors who lived alone. I often joined her on those visits. We'd sit in dim living rooms with men and women whose families had long since stopped visiting, or who had no families left at all. They told us stories of their youth, of loves lost, of wars fought, of children who had moved away and forgotten them. I could see the loneliness in their eyes, and I recognized something familiar. One evening, after we returned from visiting an old gentleman named Harold, who hadn't spoken to anyone but us for weeks, Margaret turned to me at the kitchen table. "Elaine," she said softly, "there are so many like him, people with no one left. Our home is too big for just the two of us. What if we did something more?" I raised an eyebrow. "More?" She leaned forward, her eyes shining with that fire I'd always admired. "What if this house became a place where people like Harold could live, where they could feel safe, cared for, and not alone?" I stared at her, half stunned. "Turn our house into what a kind of home?" She nodded eagerly. "Yes, a care home, not like those cold institutions we've seen, but something warm, something built on kindness, on dignity." At first, I dismissed it as a romantic idea. The house wasn't that big, and we had no experience in running such a place. But Margaret was never one to let an idea die quietly. She researched, she planned, she spoke with community leaders and local officials, and slowly, impossibly, her vision began to take shape. By the mid-1990s, we had applied for the proper licenses, renovated the downstairs rooms, and hired a small staff of caregivers. It wasn't easy. The renovations alone nearly drained our savings. I spent countless weekends with a hammer in hand, knocking down walls, building ramps, and repainting ceilings until my back ached. Margaret, meanwhile, managed the paperwork, interviewed nurses, and designed a daily program for the residents. When the first 3 elderly tenants moved in, I thought my heart would burst with pride and fear. Were we really prepared for this? But Margaret was right, as she so often was. The house filled with life again, not with children this time, but with men and women who desperately needed a place to belong. I'll never forget our first Christmas with the residents. We decorated the house together, stringing lights, baking biscuits, singing carols in the sitting room. One of the residents, Mrs. Thompson, told us it was the first time she'd felt part of a family in over a decade. Tears streamed down Margaret's face as she hugged her. From then on, the house wasn't just a house anymore. It became a sanctuary, a place where people who had been cast aside by the world could rediscover dignity and companionship. And though it was hard work, endless hard work, it gave us a sense of purpose I can't put into words. Of course, not everyone understood. Some of our neighbors thought we were mad for opening our home to strangers. David worried it would consume us financially. Claire wondered if it would be too stressful for us in our later years. But Margaret never wavered. "This house is meant to be lived in," she told them firmly. "Not just by us, but by anyone who needs it." As the years passed, the home grew. We expanded into the garden, built new rooms, and eventually registered it officially under the name Rosewood House. That name was Margaret's choice. She loved roses, and the garden out back always bloomed with them. When she passed away in the early 2000s, it felt like the light had gone out of the place. I wanted to give it all up then, to close the doors and retreat into grief. But every time I walked through the halls, every time I saw a resident smile, because of the care Margaret had set in motion, I felt her presence. It was as though she was telling me to carry on. So I did. I stepped back from the day-to-day management, eventually, leaving it in the hands of a capable team. But I never gave up ownership. That house was too much a part of me, of us, to let go. I kept my name on every document, every deed, every record, not because I wanted control, but because I wanted to protect the dream Margaret and I had built. What my children never realized, what they never bothered to ask, was that Rosewood wasn't just some random care home. It was ours. It was mine. It was born from Margaret's heart and my hands. And so when David and Claire drove me there, thinking they were ridding themselves of a burden, I could only shake my head at the cruel irony. They believed they were placing me in the care of strangers, in a place I didn't belong. But in truth, they had brought me back home. I sometimes wonder if Margaret orchestrated it all from beyond the grave. her gentle hand guiding events so that I would not spend my final years in some cold, unfamiliar institution. Instead, I ended up surrounded by walls we had built together, among people who carried the spirit of her compassion. That house is more than brick and mortar. It is love made solid. It is our legacy. And one day, my children will learn that legacy is not something you discard when it becomes inconvenient. It is something you honor, or it will rise to confront you. I always believed that if I gave my children love, security, and every ounce of my strength, they would carry that forward into their own lives and, perhaps naively, back to me when my body grew too frail to stand alone. That's what we parents tell ourselves, isn't it? That sacrifice will somehow circle back. That gratitude will one day bloom where we planted it. But life rarely follows the scripts we write in our heads. For years after Margaret passed, I tried to be both father and mother to David and Claire, even though by then they were adults with lives of their own. I never asked them for much, just a phone call here, a visit there. Sometimes they remembered, sometimes they didn't. I told myself it was the pace of modern life, that they were too busy with work, with families, with obligations. I swallowed the loneliness and kept quiet. But as I grew older, my body began to betray me. My knees ached like rusty hinges, my eyesight blurred, and the simplest tasks that once cost me nothing began to demand energy I no longer had. I still clung to independence, refusing help when offered, insisting I could manage on my own. I didn't want to become what I feared most, a burden. It was after one particularly bad fall in the kitchen that things began to change. I had slipped on a wet floor, landing hard on my hip. The pain was sharp, but mercifully not permanent. I remember lying there, staring at the ceiling tiles, thinking of Margaret, wondering if this was how she'd greet me at last. But I managed to drag myself to a chair and call David. When he arrived, his expression wasn't just concern, it was frustration, even annoyance. He scolded me as though I were a child who'd misbehaved. "Dad, you can't keep living like this. You're going to kill yourself one of these days." I laughed weakly, trying to brush it off. "I'm not that fragile, son. Just a bit clumsy, that's all." But he didn't smile. From that moment on, a shift occurred. Conversations with my children became less about how I was feeling and more about what I was costing them: time, energy, worry. Claire would sigh over the phone when I mentioned being tired. David would calculate, almost aloud, the hours he was losing by coming to check on me. One evening, over dinner at David's house in Manchester, the conversation turned sharp. I had barely finished my soup when he leaned across the table and said, "Dad, we need to talk seriously about your situation." I frowned, confused. "What situation?" "You're living alone," he said flatly. "It's not working anymore. Claire and I have talked about it. You need more help than we can give." Claire, sitting beside him, nodded with that false gentleness she always wore when she had something unpleasant to say. "It's not that we don't want to help, Dad. It's just, you've had a few falls. You forget your medication sometimes, and we worry. It's not safe." The words cut deep. "So what do you suggest? That I hire a nurse? That you visit more often?" David shook his head. "No, we think it's time you moved into a care facility." The fork slipped from my hand and clattered against the plate. My chest tightened. "A facility," I repeated, as though the word itself were foreign. "Yes," Claire said softly. "Somewhere you'll have people around all the time. You won't be alone." I stared at them both, disbelief flooding through me. "So, after everything, after all the years of raising you, of breaking my back so you'd never go without, you want to put me away like some old coat you're tired of wearing?" David's jaw clenched. "That's not fair, Dad. This is for your own good, and ours. We can't keep doing this. It's too much. Too much." There it was again, the phrase that would echo in my ears long after I wanted to shout, to pound the table, to remind them of every sacrifice Margaret and I had made. But the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I whispered, "I never thought my own children would see me as a burden." The room fell silent. Claire looked down at her plate. David didn't deny it. That night, I walked home in the rain, my coat heavy with water, and my heart heavier still. I knew then that something had broken between us. The bond of family, the unspoken promise that we look after each other no matter what. That promise had been severed. A week later, David showed up at my house with a folder of brochures. "I've already arranged a few visits," he said, laying them out on the table as though we were discussing holiday destinations. "Pictures of Smiling nurses and spotless rooms stared back at me from glossy pages. I pushed them away. "I'm not going." He sighed, exasperated. "Dad, you don't have a choice. We can't keep doing this." Those words again, "we can't keep doing this," as though my existence was an inconvenience, as though love had been replaced by obligation. From that moment on, I stopped speaking freely with them. I became guarded, quiet, watching them carefully. My children, the very people I had built my life around, were planning to discard me. They thought they were being practical, responsible. But all I could feel was betrayal. It wasn't just that they wanted me in a care home. It was that they decided without me, as if my opinion no longer mattered, as if I were a piece of furniture to be moved at their convenience. And so, when the day came, when they bundled me into David's car under the guise of lunch out, a part of me already knew what awaited. The silence in the car, the nervous glances, the weight in my chest. I had felt it all before. But what they never anticipated, what they could not have imagined, was that their betrayal would bring me full circle, that by trying to discard me, they would unknowingly place me back into the very heart of my life's work. That irony still burns in me. They thought they were leaving me behind. Instead, they brought me home. And while the sting of their betrayal will never fade completely, it has also given me a clarity I didn't expect. Love given freely is not always returned. Sacrifice does not guarantee gratitude. Sometimes, the people you raise with everything you have will grow blind to the very hands that fed them. But I am not just their father. I am Margaret's husband. I am the boy from Birmingham who survived hunger and cold. I am the man who built a home and turned it into a legacy. And though they may see me as a burden, I know the truth. I am far more than that. I can still remember the way the car smelled, that day-like leather polish mixed with the faint tang of David's cologne. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out the rain-streaked window, the countryside rolling past in muted shades of grey and green. The silence was unbearable, punctuated only by the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers. Neither David nor Claire said much. That silence told me more than words could. I knew something was wrong. You can feel betrayal before you see it. It hangs heavy in the air, pressing down on your chest like a stone. My children had spoken in hushed tones for weeks, dropping half-truths and rehearsed reassurances. "It's for your own good, Dad. You'll be more comfortable there." But no amount of soft words could disguise the fact that I was being led away from the life I had built, the home Margaret and I had poured our hearts into. The car turned off the main road, winding through lanes I knew well. My stomach twisted. I recognized the streets, the familiar corners of Birmingham, where Margaret and I had spent our early years. And then there it was, the gate. Even after all these years, it stood tall and unyielding, the wrought iron curves exactly as I remembered. My breath caught in my throat. My hands trembled in my lap as we rolled closer, the tires crunching over the gravel drive. I whispered, almost to myself, "This can't be." But it was. David pulled into the circular drive, parking neatly. In front of the building, Claire reached over from the back seat, placing a hand on my shoulder. "We're here, Dad." Her tone was gentle, but there was an edge of finality in it, as if she were delivering me to a fate already sealed. I stepped out of the car, my knees stiff and uncooperative. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the facade before me. The old stone walls, the high-arched windows, the ivy that still crept along the sides. It was all the same. Time had touched it, yes, but the essence remained. This was no ordinary nursing home. This was my home. The very house Margaret and I had bought when our children were small. The house I had built room by room, repairing, painting, fixing every crack with my own two hands. The house where Christmas mornings had been filled with laughter, where birthdays had been celebrated, where Margaret and I had whispered our dreams into the quiet of night. And now this sacred place bore a sign out front, "Ashwood Care Home." My heart stopped. I could feel my legs weaken beneath me, as though the ground itself had shifted. The betrayal deepened just because they had brought me to a home, but because they had brought me here, to my house. I turned to David, my voice raw. "Do you know what this place is?" He frowned, avoiding my eyes. "It's a good facility, Dad. They'll take care of you here." I clenched my fists, anger rising despite my frailty. "This isn't just a facility. This is my house. Your mother and I raised you here. Every brick, every beam, I paid for it. I built it. I bled for it. And now you're leaving me here as though I was some stranger." Claire's eyes widened in shock. What, Dad? This was your house? I let out a bitter laugh. You didn't even know. You didn't recognize the windows you used to press your little faces against, waiting for me to come home from work. You didn't remember the garden where your mother planted roses every spring. David shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tight. Dad, it doesn't matter who owned it before. What matters is that it's safe for you now. That's all we care about. His words cut me to the core. It doesn't matter who owned it before. To him, to them, history had no weight. Memory meant nothing. I turned back to the house, my eyes tracing the familiar lines of the roof, the curve of the front steps. I remembered carrying Margaret over that threshold on our wedding day, her laughter ringing in my ears. I remembered Claire learning to ride her first bike in the drive, falling and scraping her knees while I rushed to pick her up. I remembered David helping me repaint the shutters, his small hands smudged with blue. And now, here I was, an old man standing on the same steps, about to be left behind by the very children who had made those memories with me. Inside, the halls smelled faintly of disinfectant, mixed with the ghost of home-cooked meals that would never return. The wallpaper had been replaced, the furniture modernized, but I could still see traces of what once was. The outline of where our family photographs had hung, the grooves in the banister, where my hands had smoothed the wood over decades. The creak in the third stair I had never gotten around to fixing. A young nurse approached, her smile bright and practiced. "Welcome, Mr. Thompson. We're so happy to have you here. Happy to have me." As though I was some guest checking into a hotel. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her that this wasn't just a facility. It was my life, my history. But the words caught in my throat, choked by a mix of grief and rage. Instead, I nodded silently, my eyes never leaving the walls. As David and Claire followed the nurse, I lagged behind, my steps slow, deliberate. I ran my hand along the wall, feeling the cold paint, remembering the warmth it once held. Margaret's laughter seemed to echo faintly in the corners, as though she was still there, just out of sight. When we reached the room they had prepared for me, I stopped at the doorway. A bed, a dresser, a chair by the window. It was all so sterile, so impersonal. Not a trace of Margaret, not a whisper of our life. David cleared his throat. "We'll leave you to settle in, Dad. We'll come visit soon." I turned to him then, my voice sharp. "Visit in my own house. You've stripped it of everything that mattered, and now you'll come visit, as if I were an exhibit in a museum." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "We thought we were doing the right thing." I shook my head. The right thing would have been to remember who I am, where I came from, what I built. Instead, you've forgotten it all. And now you've brought me back to the beginning, whether you realized it or not. They left soon after, their figures retreating down the hall like shadows fading at dusk. I stood at the window of that sterile room, staring out at the garden Margaret once loved. The roses were gone, replaced by neatly trimmed hedges, but in my mind's eye, I saw her there still kneeling in the soil, her hands covered in earth, her face glowing with joy. Tears welled in my eyes, and for the first time in years, I whispered her name aloud. Margaret. The betrayal, cut deep, yes, but standing there, in the house that had shaped every corner of my life, I realized something profound. They had not stripped me of everything. The memories were still mine, the walls still remembered. And though my children had abandoned me, my home had not. This place was not just a care home, it was a monument to love, to sacrifice, to endurance. And now, it was mine once more. The nights in Ashwood Care Home were the hardest. Silence pressed against the walls, broken only by the hum of the heating system and the occasional shuffle of footsteps in the corridor. Sleep rarely came easily. I would lie in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, and the ghosts of my past would seep through the cracks of memory like water finding its way through stone. On the second night, I rose before dawn. The staff encouraged us to stay in our rooms unless escorted, but this was still my house. I didn't need permission to walk through the halls I had once painted with my own hands. So I slipped on my slippers and shuffled out quietly, my cane tapping against the polished floorboards. The corridors were dim, lit by small wall lamps that cast long shadows. I walked slowly, tracing my fingers along the walls as if they were braille, each touch bringing back echoes of what once had been. I reached the dining hall first. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and oatmeal porridge. From the previous day, but in my mind I could smell roast beef and Yorkshire pudding, the Sunday dinners Margaret used to cook. The large windows overlooked the garden, and though the hedges had been trimmed into neat little boxes, I could still picture Margaret kneeling among her roses, her wide-brimmed hat shielding her from the sun. I stood at the doorway, almost expecting to hear the sound of children's laughter spilling across the table, David asking for more gravy, Claire stealing roast potatoes when she thought no one was watching. My throat tightened, and I had to steady myself against the doorframe. Moving on, I found myself at the staircase, the same staircase where I had sat with Claire the night she was frightened of the thunderstorm. I had held her close, promising her that the storm would pass, that she was safe in her father's arms. The banister still carried the faint grooves from decades of use. My hand fit perfectly into its curve, like it had been shaped for me alone. Step by step, I climbed to the second floor. My knees protested, but I pressed on, driven by something I could not name. At the end of the hall was what used to be our master bedroom. Now it had been converted into a small lounge for residents, with armchairs arranged in a circle and a television humming in the corner. But I could still see Margaret there, sitting at her vanity, brushing her hair before bed. I could still hear the soft rustle of sheets as we whispered into the night about our dreams, our children, our worries. I walked slowly around the room, ignoring the curious stares of two early risers, already watching the morning news. I was searching not for objects, but for traces. Memories cling to places like dust. They settle in corners, in floorboards, in the air itself, and as I breathed in, I could almost taste the sweetness of our life together. It was then that I noticed something. On the far wall, beneath the new coat of paint, there was a faint outline, a rectangle, slightly darker than the surrounding plaster. I knew instantly what it was. That was where our wedding portrait had hung for nearly 40 years. Margaret in her lace dress, me in a suit that was a size too big, both of us smiling as though we had already conquered the world. I reached out, pressing my palm against the wall, and for a fleeting moment, I felt as though she was standing beside me again. "Margaret," I whispered, my voice breaking. The two residents glanced at me, puzzled, but I didn't care. This was my home, my memory, my truth. As I turned to leave, my gaze fell on the old oak wardrobe tucked in the corner. It wasn't ours. The care home had filled the space with generic furniture, but it triggered another memory. The wardrobe Margaret and I had shared had a stubborn door that always stuck. I would tug at it, curse under my breath, and she would laugh at me, coming over to give it a gentle tap in just the right spot. "See, you just need a woman's touch." She would grin, and I'd roll my eyes, but I loved her for it. That memory warmed me, like sunlight breaking through a cloud. I wandered further, room by room, corner by corner. The library, once our children's playroom, brought back the sound of building blocks tumbling to the floor. The sunroom, once Margaret's sewing nook, carried the faint hum of her singer machine, stitching clothes for the children when money was tight. Everywhere I went, the past rose up to meet me. Some memories were sweet, others sharp with pain, but together they formed a tapestry, proof that my life had not been wasted, that love had once thrived here in abundance. Later that day, as the residents gathered for afternoon tea, I sat apart, gazing out the window. Claire had promised to visit soon, but I knew promises had a way of fading when they were inconvenient. Still, I had found something my children could never take away from me, the certainty that this house remembered me, even if they didn't. That evening, I returned to the garden. The roses were gone, replaced by neatly planted shrubs. But if I closed my eyes, I could hear Margaret humming softly as she worked, feel the heat of the sun on my back as I knelt beside her, planting bulbs that would bloom long after the season ended. I knelt down, ignoring the ache in my knees, and brushed my hand across the soil. It was cooler now, sterilized and managed, but beneath it was the same earth Margaret had loved. "Do you remember, my love?" I whispered. "Do you remember how we dreamed of growing old here? Well, I suppose we have." Tears blurred my vision, but they were not just tears of sorrow, they were tears of recognition. My children might see Ashwood Care Home as nothing more than a facility, but to me, it was alive with history, with laughter, with the spirit of a woman who had never truly left. And for the first time since David and Claire had driven away, leaving me behind, I felt something stir inside me, a quiet strength, a sense that perhaps I was not as abandoned as I had thought. The house had not forgotten me, and as long as I walked its halls, neither would I forget it. The following weeks in Ashwood Care Home blurred into a strange rhythm. There were meals at fixed hours, polite conversations with residents whose memories often drifted into fog, and the daily shuffle of staff tending to us with gentle efficiency. Too many, it might have felt like the slow erosion of life, a waiting room for the inevitable. But for me, it became something else. Because as I walked those halls, as I touched the walls that remembered me, I realized that this place was not simply a care home. It was not simply a facility where the elderly were tucked away until forgotten. No, this was my house, my walls, my floors, my gardens. My life was woven into its very foundation, and though my children may have abandoned me here, they had also, unknowingly, returned me to the heart of my story. At first, I thought of this as irony, but as the days turned into weeks, I began to see it differently. Perhaps it was providence. Perhaps it was Margaret's hand guiding me, reminding me that no matter what my children thought, no matter how they labeled me as a burden, as dead weight, this house stood as proof that my life had mattered. One afternoon, I gathered a small group of residents in the lounge. They were used to sitting quietly, watching the television drone on about politics or soap operas, their attention flickering in and out. But I couldn't stand the silence anymore. I cleared my throat. "Would you like to hear a story?" I asked. A few heads lifted, some shrugged. One woman, Elsie, smiled faintly and said, "Go on then." And so, I began. I told them about the day Margaret and I first bought this house in 1962, how we had scraped every penny together, how I had worked overtime at the mill in Leeds, how Margaret had sold her mother's heirloom brooch to cover the deposit. I painted the picture of that day, the key heavy in my palm, Margaret laughing with tears in her eyes, the children toddling in the garden where weeds grew taller than they did. The room fell silent. Even the ones who often drifted seemed anchored, listening. The next day, I told them about the Christmas of 1975, when a blizzard had nearly trapped us inside. We had lit candles, roasted chestnuts in the fireplace, and the children had built forts of blankets in the living room. I could still hear their squeals of joy, smell the wood smoke, feel Margaret's hand slip into mine as we sat on the sofa, whispering about how lucky we were. By the third day, they began to ask me, "What happened next, Mr. Elaine?" It startled me, the way their eyes lit up. Some of them had children who never visited. Some of them had forgotten their own stories. But my words gave them a window, a reminder of what life had been. And in telling my story, I realized I was also reminding myself I was not just an old man discarded in a home. I was a husband, a father, a builder of memories. One evening, I sat in the garden as the sun dipped low, and a young nurse named Rebecca came to sit beside me. "You've caused quite the stir, you know," she said with a grin. "Have I?" I chuckled. "Yes, the residents talk about your stories all the time. Some even tell their families about them when they visit." Her words sank deep. It had been a long time since anything I said had mattered to anyone. I looked at her and said quietly, "It's funny, isn't it? My children thought they were leaving me here to be forgotten. But instead, they left me in a place where my memories are alive, where my legacy still speaks." Rebecca nodded, her eyes shining with a compassion I had not felt from my own kin in years. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about Margaret. Again, I imagined her smiling, approving. She had always told me that our lives mattered, not because of wealth or success, but because of the love we poured into others. And here I was, in my final chapter, still pouring love not into my children, who had turned away but into strangers who listened, who cared. A realization struck me then, sharp as lightning. Legacy is not about who remembers you. It's about what you leave behind in the hearts of others. And so, I began to live differently. I walked with new purpose. Each morning, I would share a new story, sometimes about Margaret, sometimes about the house, sometimes about the small joys and sorrows that had shaped me. I helped residents write letters to their children, even when they weren't sure their children would read them. I sat with the lonely, held the hands of the dying, listened to the babbling of those lost in dementia as though their words were poetry. The staff began to call me the historian, but I didn't correct them. It wasn't history I was sharing, it was life. One Sunday afternoon, Claire finally visited. She looked tired, as though she had come out of obligation more than desire. "Hello, Dad," she said, standing awkwardly at the foot of my bed. I studied her carefully. Once, she had been the little girl afraid of thunderstorms, clinging to me for comfort. Now she was a woman with lines of worry etched into her face, too hurried, too distracted. "Claire," I said softly, "do you remember this house?" She frowned. "Of course I do, but it's different now." "Yes," I replied, "but the walls remember, the garden remembers, and so do I." For a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Was it guilt? Nostalgia? I couldn't be sure, but she sat down beside me, and for the first time in years, we spoke. Not about obligations, not about frustrations, but about memories. She listened as I told her about the stories I'd been sharing with the residents, and slowly, her face softened. She even smiled once or twice. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a crack in the wall she had built, and that was enough. When she left, I sat back in my chair, my heart strangely light. Perhaps one day my children would see me not as a burden, but as the man who had built their foundation, who had given them love, security, and roots. Or perhaps they never would. But either way, it didn't matter as much anymore, because legacy is not measured in their approval. It is measured in the stories I tell, in the kindness I share, in the way the house still whispers my name when I walk its halls. And so, I no longer saw Ashwood as a prison. I saw it as a stage, my final chapter. Yes, but one that I would write with courage, with memory, with love. And when my time came, I knew this house would not forget me, because in truth, it had always been